In the summer of 1944, deep behind the hedgerows of occupied France, one Allied radio operator keyed his transmitter, and an entire German division moved to strike ghosts. This is the true story of how a single voice rewrote a battlefield. Summer, 1944. Europe was burning on every front. Just weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy, the German High Command was fighting the war it had always feared, a grinding, multi-front collapse. Panzer divisions were being ripped from one sector and thrown desperately into another. SS units, the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe's field divisions, all were displaced, fragmented, and exhausted. The front lines of France no longer resembled a solid defensive wall, but a fraying patchwork of units struggling to understand where the next Allied blow would fall. And in that chaos, information, even the faintest whisper carried by radio static, became as powerful as any tank. Across Normandy, Allied deception groups were threading their invisible web. From the British Runner Force to the US Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the so-called Ghost Army, these units operated with one mission: distort German intelligence enough to make them chase shadows. Inflatable tanks, dummy camps, false traffic on the roads, but the most precise, most dangerous weapon of deception was the radio. Because the Germans were listening. Always. Their signals intelligence service, the Funkaufklärung, had spent years perfecting radio interception, direction finding, and traffic analysis. They could read patterns in call signs, message density, radio discipline, even infer unit size based solely on how many operators were on the net at once. To the Germans, radio waves were footprints. And footprints meant units. Divisions. Armies. It was into this invisible battlefield that a single Allied operator now walked. The first visual is darkness. A moonless July night. A camouflaged slit trench carved into a hedgerow field near the Norman front. Inside, hunched over a small, shielded wireless set, sits one man. His face is dimly lit by the soft glow of vacuum tubes. Sweat lines his temples, not from fear, but from concentration. He taps a key. Short. Precise. Mechanical. To a distant German listening post, this is the voice of an armored battalion. Its roll call, its message acknowledgements, its routine nightly chatter. But in reality, everything is coming from this one cramped slit trench, from one operator mimicking the rhythm and imperfections of an entire multi-vehicle radio net. His call signs have been carefully constructed to match those of US armored units known to be operating in Normandy. His traffic patterns imitate the pulse of a battalion preparing to move, because that is the illusion the Allied command wants the Germans to believe, that armored reinforcements are massing in the sector, where in truth, only a deception team sits in the dark. Behind him, in a shallow foxhole, lies a bundle of equipment: spare batteries, a folded map, a list of pre-approved messages, and a laminated card containing the battalion's order of battle he must pretend to represent. Tanks he has never seen. Officers he has never met. Companies that do not exist. He is one man speaking for hundreds. With each transmission, the radio waves stretch across the French countryside, climbing into the sky, bouncing off the ionosphere, and spilling into the headphones of German intercept teams miles away. The operator knows the danger. Allied deception radios were designed to lure German direction-finding units. And once the Germans fix a location, they move to investigate, sometimes with artillery, sometimes with reconnaissance patrols. Tonight, something changes. As the operator completes the scheduled roll call, a flicker of unease crosses his face. His set picks up faint interference, a German signal, short, clipped, encrypted. Not unusual, but close. Too close. Unbeknownst to him, in a wooded pocket several kilometers away, German listening posts have begun triangulating his signal. The bearings are tightening. The lines are converging. A mobile intercept team starts its engines and begins to move. And the man in the trench has no idea they're coming. Before he ever crouched in a Norman trench, tapping out the heartbeat of a unit that did not exist, he had already entered one of the strangest and most secretive brotherhoods of the Second World War, the world of Allied deception. Its soldiers did not carry rifles into battle. Their weapons were illusions. In 1944, the Allied High Command understood that, in modern warfare, deception could pin down entire divisions, shape enemy strategy, and save thousands of lives. That philosophy gave birth to specialized formations: the American 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the British Special Duties Units, and clandestine operators trained by the Office of Strategic Services. Their mission was not to fight the Germans head-on, but to mislead them, to manipulate what the German 7th Army thought it saw. The men chosen for radio deception were a rare breed. Many were artists, sound engineers, linguists, and signal experts recruited not for brute strength, but for precision, creativity, and composure under pressure. They were trained at places like Camp Forest, Fort Meade, and British listening schools in Dorset and Kent, where instructors taught them the dark art of signal fingerprinting. Every radio operator, no matter how disciplined, left behind a signature, a rhythm, a cadence, tiny imperfections that formed a kind of Morse handwriting. German signals analysts, some veterans of the Abwehr's pre-war intercept bureaus, had become masters at identifying this handwriting. They could often tell if a message came from a seasoned sergeant, a new recruit, or a fatigued operator. Worse still, they could detect when the same operator appeared to be transmitting for multiple units, a telltale sign of deception. That is why the Allies needed specialists who could imitate not one, but dozens of fictional operators. Our protagonist was one of them. He had been a wireless specialist long before reaching the French coast. Trained in Morse discipline, frequency management, speed modulation, and the subtle art of German listening habits, he learned to shape his transmissions to match what enemy analysts expected from a real armored battalion. In training, instructors drilled him relentlessly, vary the spacing between characters, shift tempo slightly between messages, and memorize the personalities of each fictional operator he would impersonate. One was deliberately sloppy. One used heavy spacing. Another tapped with sharp, impatient precision. To the Germans, these differences meant multiple radios, multiple men, a real unit. His equipment was equally important. At his side lay an array of radios, the dependable SCR-300 backpack set for short-range work, and bulkier long-range transmitters that allowed signals to travel far enough to be intercepted by German direction-finding units north of the Seine. He carried laminated frequency charts, carefully timed message schedules, and stacks of pre-written chatter sheets that simulated day-to-day battalion traffic, vehicle maintenance reports, supply requests, reconnaissance check-ins, and tactical readiness updates. Every message had been vetted by intelligence officers to ensure it matched real U.S. armored doctrine. Even simple phrases like "Ready 1" or "Stand to complete" had to be authentic, because if anything sounded off, even slightly, the Germans would notice. But the equipment and training told only part of the story. The rest was psychological. Unlike infantrymen, tank crews, or artillery teams, radio deceivers fought the war alone. When he entered his slit trench each night, he carried no rifle, no squad, no supporting fire, only a radio set whose glowing tubes could give away his position, and a Morse key whose every tap risked betraying him to German intercept teams. He was both invisible and exposed, a soldier whose success required being heard, but never seen. He knew the stakes. A mistimed message, a slip in cadence, or an unexpected increase in chatter could lead German analysts to label his transmissions as suspect. And once they grew suspicious, they would begin triangulation. Intercept trucks, loop antennas, motorized patrols, all searching for the source of a signal that seemed to belong to an armored battalion. And by late July 1944, that is exactly what began to happen. Somewhere inside the labyrinth of German 7th Army headquarters, a signals officer added a new marking to the operations map, a supposed U.S. armored battalion that had appeared suddenly in a sector where no tanks were believed to be operating. A unit that existed only in the static. But now, the Germans believed it was real. Dawn in Normandy arrived slowly in the summer of 1944, filtered through a maze of hedgerows that seemed to swallow the early sunlight. This was the Bocage country, a landscape of narrow lanes, earthen embankments, and centuries-old hedges that turned every field into a concealed fortress. It was here, in this green labyrinth, that an American deception operator waged a silent war against the German 7th Army. And the illusion he created was beginning to reshape the battlefield. From his hidden position, he manipulated the airwaves with the precision of a surgeon. He shifted frequencies at irregular intervals, imitating the structured chaos of an armored battalion on the move. When a real unit relocated, multiple radios would check in on alternate bands, relay stations would hand off messages, and maintenance crews would transmit equipment status updates. He reproduced all of it, alone. By staggering transmissions across pre-selected channels, he simulated relay nodes that did not exist. He fabricated supply reports ordered by the deception planners weeks earlier, fuel shortages, ammunition tallies, and cryptic requests for spare parts typical of armored units operating under pressure. Each message had technical authenticity, the right format, the right call signs, the right rhythm, but the unit? Pure invention. Across the lines, German radio interception teams monitoring Allied signals began to take note. They were exhausted, overextended, and fighting a losing battle to understand the shifting Allied front. Since early July, German divisions, including battered remnants of Panzerlehr, elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and infantry regiments retreating from the Sector, were stretched thin, trying to slow the American breakout toward St. Lo. Command posts were bombed, lines of communication severed, and intelligence officers were piecing together reports from scattered observation posts and fading radio nets. In that fog of war, the sudden appearance of a new American armored formation was alarming. The German intercept operators first logged it as routine movement chatter. But within days, the volume of transmissions grew. Patterns emerged. The Phantom Battalion reported fuel dumps, reconnaissance patrols, and readiness levels consistent with armored forces preparing to exploit a breakthrough. The Germans knew the Americans favored aggressive, fast-moving armor pushes, and this Phantom unit appeared to be assembling in a sector dangerously close to their weakened flank. The deception was working. German signals officers redrew their operational maps. Pencil markings shifted westward. Arrows indicating possible Allied thrusts now accounted for this new armored presence. Units already strained by the relentless retreat were ordered to reposition. Artillery batteries adjusted firing plans to guard against a widening of the American offensive. Reconnaissance patrols were dispatched to probe the area where the radio traffic suggested tanks might be massing. Everything, from artillery movements to strategic assumptions, stemmed from messages tapped out by a single operator hidden in the hedgerows. Within the German ranks, debates intensified. Some officers believed this represented the early phase of a major maneuver, perhaps even a larger force preparing to encircle retreating formations. Others argued it might be deception, but few were willing to ignore a threat that carried the cadence of authentic U.S. armored communications. The Western Front was collapsing. No commander wanted to be responsible for overlooking a breakout force. On the Allied side, few realized the scale of the effect. Commanders running the real offensives, Operation Cobra to the west, the grinding fight around Cannes to the east, had no way of knowing that a lone deception operator was tying down a significant portion of the German observation and response network. They saw resistance weaken in certain sectors, but could not yet see why. It was the nature of deception. Its greatest triumphs remained invisible. But deception was not invulnerable. German direction-finding equipment, though limited by terrain, was still deadly in experienced hands. Loop antennas on mobile intercept trucks worked in coordinated sweeps. Listening stations east of St. Lo cross-checked bearings with units positioned near the Via River. Each reading narrowed the potential source of the mysterious armored battalion. And then, during an afternoon sweep, they detected the signal again, stronger than before. The bearing line sharpened. A second station confirmed it. A third triangulation point narrowed the radius to a span of hedgerows and farmland barely a kilometre wide. German officers acted quickly. A rapid response detachment, reconnaissance vehicles and infantry elements, was ordered to move. They did not expect to find one man. They expected half a battalion of American armor preparing to strike. Engines roared to life. Patrols advanced through the narrow lanes. And in the shadows of the bocage, the deception operator continued sending his messages, unaware that the Germans were closing in, this time with purpose. The Germans were closing in. In the bocage country of Normandy, sound travelled strangely. Engines echoed off hedgerows. Metallic clanks rolled across fields like distant thunder. And now, as German triangulation teams pushed deeper into the countryside, those sounds crept ever closer to the deception operator concealed somewhere in the dense, suffocating green. 4 direction-finding units, his signal was a thread, faint, elusive, but real. Every time he tapped his Morse key, that thread brightened. German operators logged each burst of transmission, then called out bearings. Mobile teams aligned loop antennas, their needles twitching as they swept the sky. It was painstaking work, coordinating distant intercept posts, comparing angles, drawing converging lines on a transparent map board. But it was also deadly precise. Under typical conditions, a trained German direction-finding team needed 30 to 90 seconds of uninterrupted signal to lock coordinates with lethal accuracy. And so the operator lived on a knife's edge. Too short a transmission and the Germans might dismiss his unit as fake or inactive, jeopardizing the deception. Too long, and he would be found. Every message became a calculation. Every tap a risk. Through the day he stayed silent, buried in his camouflaged hide. At night he moved, slowly, silently, carrying his heavy equipment through mud that clung to his boots like glue. The radios, batteries, and antenna components weighed nearly as much as an infantryman's combat pack. He shifted positions between hedgerows, slipping through narrow sunken lanes that had seen centuries of cartwheels, livestock, and now tanks. Sometimes he passed near farmhouses where French families whispered in fear as German patrols rolled by, their engines coughing in the cold night air. He couldn't reveal himself. He couldn't help them. He carried a war that depended on his anonymity. But the strain showed. Fatigue sharpened every sound. A snapped twig sent adrenaline through his veins. Yet the mission demanded more, not less. As the German division became increasingly concerned about the new armored battalion that seemed to be gathering strength, the deception planners fed the operator updated traffic patterns. Now he had to simulate tension on the American side, urgency, mobility, signs of imminent action. So he added panicked edges to his transmissions. Broken relays. Abrupt location reports. Requests for reinforcements consistent with an armored battalion preparing to exploit a breakthrough. The Germans reacted exactly as the Allied strategists hoped. The division monitoring his sector was already battered from weeks of retreat. Fuel stocks were low. Personnel exhausted. Vehicles prone to breakdown. Yet they began maneuvering aggressively to counter the threat, shifting reconnaissance units, redeploying anti-tank guns, and repositioning artillery batteries toward the imagined axis of advance. Every kilometer they moved wasted precious fuel. Every realignment drained scarce manpower. Every misunderstanding compounded the chaos spreading through the German defense. One man, unseen, unnamed, was manipulating the movements of an entire enemy formation. But with each successful transmission, the noose tightened. German triangulation teams were adapting. They were now coordinating sweeps with more stations, reducing the time needed to obtain reliable bearings. They noted that the mysterious armored battalion shifted locations at night, a pattern more typical of deception operators than real US armored units, which relied on more stable communications. Suspicion grew. And with suspicion came determination. Late July brought a moment the operator had feared. A German intercept post caught one of his transmissions at unusually high signal strength. The reading suggested he was closer than they had previously believed. A second team confirmed the bearing. A third plotted it. The lines converged over a small patch of woodland north of a narrow farm lane. German officers ordered a localized sweep, reconnaissance vehicles, infantry, and tracking teams. Their mission was simple: identify the source of the signal and determine whether the unit it represented was genuine or a threat that needed immediate neutralization. Engines rumbled in the dark. Boots hit the ground. Patrols assembled at the edge of the woods. And somewhere inside those trees, preparing another transmission he could not afford to send, the operator waited, unaware that the next German sweep would be aimed directly at the last place he dared key his signal. Dawn came slowly over the bocage, bleeding pale light across the hedgerows and shattered farmsteads of Lower Normandy. Mist clung to the fields, settling in the hollows like ghostly pockets of smoke. It was the hour when patrols were sluggish, when nerves were frayed, and when decisions, good or catastrophic, could slip unnoticed into the chain of command. For the lone operator hidden beneath a collapsed orchard wall, this was the hour he had been waiting for. His equipment was cold, metal stiff with night moisture. He checked each component with the precision drilled into every member of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Antenna angles, impedance, voltage levels, signal clarity. What he was preparing to do carried consequences far beyond his own survival. It was a broadcast designed to rupture the German operational picture at a moment when both sides were stretched thin. The message he crafted was not just another fictional request for ammunition or a routine status update. It was a layered, meticulously structured radio order, exactly the kind a battalion staff would issue before launching an armored thrust. He referenced real terrain features, crossroads east of St. Lo, and spoke in a clipped, hurried tone typical of units preparing for a coordinated assault. He imitated the encrypted cadence used by Allied armored battalions operating M4 Shermans in the region. And he placed the timing, composition, and intended axes of advance just close enough to plausibility that any German signals officer would take it seriously. When he depressed the key, the transmission cut through the morning quiet like a razor. Across the battlefield, German receivers came alive. Operators of the battered division shadowing the American breakout, and elements still recovering from their costly retreat after Operation Cobra, leaned over their sets, decoding fragments, cross-referencing maps, matching unit identifiers. Their radios crackled with urgency. If an Allied armoured push was forming near the crossroads, it threatened to slice behind their line, potentially severing their already fragile logistical lifeline toward the northeast. Within minutes, orders rippled through the German ranks. Anti-tank guns, 75mm PaK-40s pulled by exhausted half-tracks, were redirected toward the supposed corridor of advance. Grenadier companies were told to reposition behind the hedgerows overlooking the road network. A handful of armoured vehicles still operational after weeks of attrition were redeployed to reinforce the sector believed to be under imminent threat. Fuel, scarce as gold, was burned. Time, even scarcer, slipped away. Because just 5 miles south, a real Allied column, infantry, engineers, and armour threading their way through the maze of fields, advanced almost entirely unopposed. The corridor they needed had existed only marginally the night before. Now it widened, shaped by an enemy diverted by the ghost of a battalion that existed only on the radio. For the operator, crouched under the orchard wall, each second of broadcast felt like a weight on his chest. He knew the mathematics of his own survival. German direction-finding teams could begin fixing his position within roughly a minute of signal. Earlier in the campaign, he had watched operators cut transmissions mid-sentence to avoid being caught. Today, he forced himself to hold the line, 30 seconds, 40, a full minute, long enough to embed authenticity, to mimic the chatter of a staff preparing for combat. Every extra heartbeat meant Allied lives saved on the far side of the hedgerows. When he finally released the key, his hand was trembling. Not from fear, at least, not fear alone, but from the knowledge that this single broadcast had shifted the German division like a lever applied to a fragile structure. His deception was no longer merely cluttering intelligence channels. It was moving battalions, artillery, and command decisions on the battlefield. But the silence that followed was short-lived. Tracking vans and foot patrols had detected him again. The triangulation was tighter this time. German boots could be heard in the distance, deliberate, searching, closing the gap. Engine noise rolled through the trees, too close to ignore. The division, misled and maneuvering frantically, had now turned part of its attention toward finding the source of the phantom threat. He packed quickly, every movement practiced. The generator, the coils, the encryption sheets, all bundled, all heavy. The hedgerows around him rustled with more than wind now. The Germans were sweeping toward the woods where he had just transmitted. And this time, they were close enough that escape would have to happen under the weight of their tightening net. Rain drifted sideways across the bocage, carried by a low, clinging fog that wrapped itself around every hedgerow and broken wall. It was the kind of weather that silenced birds, flattened sound, and reduced the world to a few yards of shifting grey. For the lone operator, it was both a shield and a warning, protection from distant eyes, but perfect cover for German patrols closing in on his last known signal. He worked quickly, fingers numb as he broke down the transmitter piece by piece. Antenna collapsed. Power pack disconnected. Code sheets folded and sealed. Every item was heavier than it had been the day before, weighed down by mud, fatigue, and the knowledge that the deception he'd sustained for days was finally collapsing. The Germans no longer hunted a phantom battalion. They hunted the man who had created it. The first sweep came before he finished packing. Faint voices in German. The click of bolts checked on carabiner 98K rifles. Then the sharp, unmistakable bark of dogs. He slung his gear over his shoulder and moved low, through the hedgerow roots slick with rainwater. His boots slid in the mud, thorns tore at his sleeves. Every step felt too loud, every breath too sharp. Patrols fanned out across the fields, combing barns, chicken coops, ditches, anywhere a saboteur or radio operator might hide. He dropped into a drainage trench just seconds before a squad passed overhead. The ditch was barely wide enough to lie in, filled with cold runoff and decomposing leaves. He pressed himself into the muck, breath held. German boots stopped directly above him. One soldier muttered an order, another aimed a flashlight beam across the brush. The dogs were close enough that he could hear their sniffing, their claws scraping against the stones. In the silence, something tapped inside his jacket, the delicate clink of spare radio crystals. It sounded deafening to him, but the rain covered the noise, washing it into the murmur of the storm. At last the patrol moved on. The operator remained still long after the footsteps faded. Only when the numbness in his arms turned to pain did he crawl out, soaked to the bone, shaking from adrenaline and cold. He pushed through the hedgerows for hours, guided only by a compass and instinct. More than once he stumbled, catching himself on roots and stones. Several times he had to double back to avoid torchlight sweeping across open ground. By the time the fog began to thin, he was half delirious, running on will alone. Just after dawn, he reached an Allied listening post concealed behind a line of shell-scarred apple trees. The sentries almost didn't recognize him, bruised, caked in mud, barely able to speak. They dragged him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and only then did command learn the full extent of what his final transmissions had accomplished. Fuel wasted. Units diverted. A corridor opened just long enough for Allied forces to slip through. When they told him, he didn't ask about commendations or credit. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words were clear. Did they make it through? And when the answer came, yes, he finally allowed himself to close his eyes. By the time the operator collapsed into the Allied listening post, the consequences of his solitary deception were already rippling across the front. For nearly 2 full days, somewhere between 36 and 48 precious hours, an entire German division had been held in place, convinced that an armoured battalion was assembling for a push toward a critical crossroads in the Normandy bocage. The division's commanders, already exhausted from weeks of retreat following the collapse of their lines in July and August 1944, could not afford to gamble. They shifted infantry regiments, pulled scarce fuel reserves from their shrinking depots, and moved their anti-tank guns into hedgerows overlooking lanes that, in their minds, would soon echo with the engines of Sherman tanks. But none came. Later intelligence assessments would retrieve captured German maps from abandoned command posts. And there, penciled into the enemy's own operational overlays, was the proof: a fictitious US armoured battalion marked by the Germans as a real, manoeuvring threat. Frequency logs recovered from German intercept teams showed hours of traffic attributed to it. Traffic the lone operator had painstakingly generated, imitating entire networks of non-existent radio men. What had begun as scattered signals had solidified, in German eyes, into a coherent unit with strength, intent, and momentum. While the enemy waited for the attack that never arrived, a very real Allied force moved several miles to the south. A column of infantry and armour, slated to exploit a gap in the German line, found the corridor unexpectedly open. Recon units reported minimal resistance. Roads believed to be under enemy observation were instead deserted. The deception had not won a battle on its own, but it had reshaped the battlefield just enough, widening a seam, delaying a counterattack, and allowing hundreds of Allied soldiers to pass through ground that might otherwise have become a killing zone. Allied officers later acknowledged the scale of what had happened. In the broader chaos of the Normandy campaign, small delays could mean entire divisions lived or died. In this case, the delay was engineered not by tanks, artillery, or infantry, but by a single man with a transmitter hidden in the hedgerows. His operation fit into a much wider and increasingly sophisticated doctrine that defined the Western Front in 1944. Deception had become a strategic weapon. Britain's Operation Fortitude had kept dozens of German divisions pinned in the Pas-de-Calais, convinced that the main Allied landing would strike there rather than Normandy. The US Army's 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, deployed inflatable tanks, sonic illusions, and spoof radio networks to cause German commanders to misread entire corps movements. Radio deception was no longer an experiment. It was a tool capable of shaping campaigns, distorting intelligence, and forcing the Wehrmacht to fight shadows. But within that grand doctrine, the story of this operator remained different, smaller, more fragile, and far more personal. No inflatable decoys stood beside him. No elaborate multi-unit deception cell backed him up. For 2 days, the entire illusion had depended on one set of hands, one voice, and one man's refusal to break under the constant risk of detection. And when it was over, his contribution disappeared behind classification seals. Reports were stamped, archived, and locked away for decades. His family received no citation, no clear explanation, no hint that their quiet son had once redirected a German division by sheer will and discipline. In the vast machinery of the Second World War, millions fought across continents. Yet here, in a pocket of Normandy's hedgerow country, the rhythm of the battlefield shifted because of a signal sent by a man whose name would not appear in the histories for generations. One man, unseen and unnamed, and the war moved around him. In the quiet aftermath of the war, long after the hedgerows of Normandy had grown thick again and the temporary grave markers had been replaced with white marble, historians began to uncover something unexpected. Victory in 1944 had not belonged solely to the armoured thrusts, the infantry divisions, or the thunder of air power. It had also belonged to shadows, to illusions crafted by handfuls of men whose battlefield left no smoke, no footprints, and no shell craters. Deception, once considered a supporting tactic, had become a genuine force multiplier. In the summer of 1944, the Western Allies learned that a well-crafted illusion could reshape entire sectors of the front as effectively as a reinforced brigade. Each false transmission, each fabricated order of battle, each phantom movement carried weight because the German command structure, strained, exhausted, and increasingly dependent on electronic intelligence, could not afford to ignore them. A convincing radio signal, timed with discipline and delivered with technical precision, could make panzer regiments shift, artillery redeploy, and fuel convoys redirect. The work of deception units like the US 23rd Headquarters Special Troops and their British counterparts hinted at a new kind of warfare. Their operations showed that modern conflict would not be decided only by firepower, but by information, controlled, distorted, and weaponized. Radio trickery in 1944 was the ancestor of the electromagnetic campaigns and cyber operations that defined the 21st century. The principles were the same: misdirect the enemy, overload their intelligence picture, and make them fight threats that do not exist. For decades, these small, fragile operations remained buried beneath layers of classification. Reports were sealed, names were redacted, and the influence of singular operators, men isolated in trenches, barns, or drainage ditches, was almost forgotten. Only with the release of declassified archives in the late 20th century did historians begin to trace the full map of illusions that had stretched across Europe. They found German situation reports describing divisions that never existed. They found intercepted signals taken as gospel by frontline commanders. They found, again and again, places where the course of battle had bent because a lone operator had keyed Morse in the right rhythm, at the right moment, on the right frequency. And in those pages, the paradox of the phantom signal becomes clear. The Second World War was a conflict fought by tens of millions across continents, oceans, and skies. Yet within that vast human storm, victory sometimes began with one man, alone in the dark, hunched over a transmitter, risking everything to make the enemy believe in a force that was never there. In a war defined by armies, armor, and aircraft, it was often the quietest voice, the one carried on a thin thread of radio static, that changed the battlefield forever.